Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to Investing Amid High Debt, Low Growth. My name is Stacey Vanek. I'm a reporter with Bloomberg and host of the podcast Everybody's Business from Bloomberg Business Week. And I am here to introduce Dr. Jeffry Frieden. Dr. Frieden is a political economist at Columbia, though he was with Harvard for many years. And he is author of the book Global Capitalism, Its Fall and Rise in the 20th Century. Though he tells me the latest edition, they tweaked the title, which is now Global Capitalism, Its Fall and Rise in the 20th Century, and Its Stumbles in the 21st, which feels like a pretty perfect segue to our talk today. Dr. Frieden has spent years studying the relationship between trade and peace and the labor economy and debt. And I think we're incredibly lucky to be hearing from him today at this moment of such profound change. Pretty much since the end of World War II, the economy has been moving towards free trade. That has really shaped our global economy. It has shaped the world we live in, and that is changing right now. I really can't think of a better person to walk us through how we got to this moment and what all of the changes of this moment are going to mean for the global economy and for all of us. And so with that, Dr. Frieden.
Thank you, Stacey. It's a great pleasure to be here. We are wondering what's happening with globalization. And to try to address that, I want to use a little bit of history, a little bit of theory, and a little bit of current events. Let's start with the history. This is not the first age of globalization. The first age of globalization was in the 19th and early 20th century. It lasted many, many decades. And as you can see from this, the world economy was very tightly integrated. International trade at very high levels. On some dimensions, the world economy was perhaps more tightly integrated than it is today. All of the major economies were tied together by the gold standard, something like a single currency. Immigration, if you were a European, was almost completely free. No documents, no papers, right? And that international economic order that lasted most of the late 19th and early 20th century was, by most standards, a great success. It was marked by rapid economic growth. In fact, the world economy grew more in the 75 years of that first age of globalization than it had in the previous 1,000 years. And most governments around the world agreed that it was a very good thing and should continue. And yet, that first era of globalization came to a crashing halt with World War I. Now, World War I was, of course, a war. You don't continue an international economy in the midst of a world war. But after the war was over, the governments of the world made every attempt to resuscitate and revive that international economic order, that first era of globalization, and failed. Conferences, treaties, international organizations, nothing was able to reconstitute that first era of globalization, despite the fact that all of the governments of the world, roughly speaking, agreed that it had been a good thing and should be rebuilt. So what was the problem? It all came to a head in 1929 when a recession in the United States led to the Smoot-Hawley tariff, trade protection, brief recession elsewhere, defaults in Europe, higher trade protection elsewhere, international financial crises, bank runs, and within a few years, the world economy was dead in the water. International trade, a fraction of what it had been. International finance, flat for the next 40 years. International investment, largely non-existent. So what happened? Why could this international economic order not be reconstituted? Well, the classical gold standard free trade era had pretty rigorous rules of the game, as was talked about at the time. If you were a member of this order, you were expected to subordinate your domestic, your national economy to the requirements of the international economic order. If your economy was out of balance, you were expected to impose austerity measures to bring it back to balance. Austerity measures that could be very painful. How is that sustainable? Well, the people who were being asked to bear the burden of adjustment, who were experiencing these sacrifices and this pain in order to maintain international economic integration, had no political voice. The major economies of the world were not democracies. Those that considered themselves democracies would not be considered democracies today. And so the people who were being asked to bear the burden of adjustment of that classical gold standard era were not able to protest. That began to change in the 1890s, and it especially changed during and after World War I. By the early 1920s, every major economy, every major advanced economy was in fact a democracy, with universal suffrage, even for women. Miracle of miracles, right? And that meant that people who had not had a political voice now had one. Labor unions and socialist parties that had been weak, suppressed, even illegal before this era, in the late 19th and early 20th century, by the 1920s were strong, powerful. Virtually every country in Europe had a socialist party in government, in some cases the leading party of government. And that meant that the ability of governments to impose these very painful austerity measures was strictly limited, because the labor movements and the socialist parties and the farmer parties and the middle class parties would no longer stand for it. So governments tried over and over to impose the kind of rigor that had characterized that gold standard era and failed. And in fact, John Maynard Keynes spent most of the interwar period pleading with policymakers and his fellow economists not to, in his words, impose the nostrums of a Victorian era on societies that are no longer Victorian. The economies had changed, the politics had changed. As Keynes put it, economies that had been characterized by family firms and family farms and disorganized labor now had big business and big labor. Right? And so, despite all the attempts to restore it, the world economy collapsed into trade wars, and then currency wars, and eventually shooting wars. After 2 world wars and the worst economic calamity in modern history, in the aftermath of World War II, the major countries of the world reconstituted an international economic order, a Western economic order. That economic order was also extraordinarily successful. As you probably know, world trade began to grow almost immediately after World War II and has continued to grow for some 70 years. Right? That, like the first era of globalization, that international economic order was quite successful. Poor countries caught up with middle-income countries. Middle-income countries caught up with rich countries. Right? Economic growth was, again, more rapid than it had been in all of human history. Right? There were a variety of characteristics of that international economic order. There were 2 pillars, and those 2 pillars were American leadership and multilateralism. American leadership in the sense that the US essentially built that post-war economic order. And it built it, to be sure, in a way that was consistent with American interests. But it also built it in a way that responded to the concerns of other countries. Multilateralism meant that there were institutions established that in some sense committed the US to take other countries' concerns into account. Other countries had a voice at the IMF, the World Bank, the GATT, eventually the WTO. And that was a bit of a guarantee that the US would not abuse its extraordinary position to exploit other countries. Those 2 pillars were essential to the international economic order built in the 1940s and 1950s by the United States and its close allies in the Western world. Right? As I say, it was extraordinarily successful. But, as you undoubtedly know, it has stalled. International trade has stalled. Globalization has stalled. And there are increasing concerns about whether this international economic order can be sustained and maintained. Those concerns largely come from within the advanced economies of the world, including the United States, which I'll focus on. Right? Those concerns come from the fact that more and more of our people feel that the world economy is not serving them, that globalization has served to enrich a narrow elite, college-educated, people in the knowledge industries, people in the prosperous big cities, that they are being asked to make sacrifices to maintain a globalization that doesn't serve them. And you know what? They're not wrong. If you look at what's happened in the United States over that period, you can see the US, and I'm focusing on the US for which we have data and which I know best, over the last 40 and more years, per capita GDP in the US has approximately doubled. But the real income of the median American household, of the typical middle-class American household, has risen by about 30%. The rest of that growth has gone to the wealthiest third of the American population. People with college educations, people in the knowledge industries, people in the prosperous big cities on the coasts, right? And it has not gone to the American middle class, to the American working class. And this pattern is repeated over and over throughout most of the advanced economies of the world. You can see here the pattern that I've just described. Remember that 2/3 of Americans do not have a college degree. And then take a look at this graph. The top two lines are people with a college or postgraduate degree. The middle line is people with some college. The next line is people with a high school degree. The line after that is people who do not have a high school degree. And you can see, and we're talking here about more than 40 years, 45 and more years, in which the real wage of people without a college degree has been stagnant or has declined. So the perception that globalization has not served large parts of our population is not wrong. And more of our people feel that governments have failed to protect them from the vagaries of the world economy, from the negative effects of globalization. Everything comes with a cost. That governments have not listened to them, have not reflected their interests, have not represented their concerns. And as people have become increasingly dissatisfied with government, they have lost faith in existing politicians, existing political parties, existing political institutions. And that's given rise to a dramatic increase in support for populist political movements that question not only globalization and European integration, but, oops, that went too fast. Let's slow it down a little bit. Not only European integration and globalization, but in some cases, the very bases of our democratic system. A steady increase in populism in the US, in Western Europe. And that is the backdrop I think we need to understand to the Trump administration. Donald Trump ran for office in 2016 on a platform that was explicitly hostile to international trade, international finance, international investment. I should point out that he was not alone, because Bernie Sanders, running for the nomination of the Democratic Party, ran on a very similar platform. You can look at the stump speeches of Sanders and Trump, and they look almost identical in their rejection of globalization. Right? And the Trump administration in office, in the first administration, delivered on those promises, ran on again in 2020, ran on them again in 2024, and now has delivered on those promises in spades. Right? The Trump administration has been quite clear that it does not accept as given those two pillars of the international economic order, American leadership and multilateralism. They don't accept American leadership as it has been understood, because they, and many Americans who support them, feel that the US is overstretched and overburdened, not getting what it needs out of the international economic order or the international political order more generally. They reject, in most instances, multilateralism because, again, the Trump administration, Donald Trump, has been quite clear that he doesn't feel, and the administration doesn't feel, that multilateralism, as currently constituted, serves American interests. The United States is better served, they say, by unilateral ties, unilateral bargains with individual countries, bilateral bargains, working out deals on a one-to-one basis. Why be restricted by the rules of multilateral institutions? Why listen to what a dispute settlement system in the World Trade Organization tells the US to do, given a complaint from Costa Rica? We can bargain directly with Costa Rica and get a much better deal. Right? So the Trump administration has rejected large aspects of that international economic order, and I have a quote here, just to be able to read it, from Donald Trump, speaking early in his first administration to the UN General Assembly. America is governed by Americans. We reject the ideology of globalism. Responsible nations must defend against threats to sovereignty from global governance. Threats to sovereignty from global governance. We will never surrender America's sovereignty to an unelected, unaccountable global bureaucracy. Right? Now, there are some in the administration who reject multilateralism completely, and there are others who believe only that it needs to be dramatically reformed and revised. When Scott Bessent spoke at the IMF World Bank meetings a couple of months ago in Washington, he insisted that the IMF and the World Bank had to be rebuilt on the basis of their founding charters, that they had strayed too far from what they should be doing, and at this point were too far from America's interests, too far from America's concerns. So whether you're of the faction that believes that multilateralism has to be dramatically revised or that it should be jettisoned, the Trump administration has made it quite clear that its commitment to multilateralism is definitely under question. This is the new reality that all countries in the world face, that the pillars of the international economic order, as we have experienced them really through our entire lifetimes, are now threatened by the most important country in the world, the United States. And countries will have to adjust and adapt and figure out how they will react to this new reality. And I want to give you an example that I think is relevant to my country, the United States, relevant to China as well, and relevant to the world. For the past 25 years, the world economy has been characterized by an unusual set of features. One group of countries in the world has had as its engine of economic growth exporting massive quantities, largely of manufactured goods, to the rest of the world. That is how they have grown. China, obviously among them, but not just China. Japan, Germany, Vietnam, all these countries have had as their secret of growth exporting to the rest of the world, consumers of the world. The second big group of countries are countries that have lived by borrowing and using the borrowed funds to consume the goods of the first group. So you've got the world divided between surplus countries and deficit countries. And that has persisted for 25 years, what we call in the business global macroeconomic imbalances. And many of us have been arguing for a good 20 years or so that these global macroeconomic imbalances are unsustainable in the long run. It is not sustainable to have one set of countries running surpluses ad infinitum and another set of countries running deficits ad infinitum. And rigorous social science theory tells us that if something is unsustainable, it will eventually come to an end. That end has been accelerated by the Trump administration that has made it quite clear that it will not stand for the pattern of deficits and surpluses that has characterized the world economy for the last 25 years. That imposes some very, very strict restraints on countries around the world because they will have to adjust to a new environment in which they can no longer run the kinds of surpluses or deficits that they have. And that's not easy because national economies are not motorcycles that you can turn around on a dime in a narrow alleyway. To turn a national economy around from one pattern of economic growth to another pattern of economic growth is economically difficult, politically difficult, and socially difficult. To take the example of China, to turn China from a country which is an exporting powerhouse, whose economic activity is oriented towards manufactured exports to the Western and other markets, to an economy that focuses on domestic consumption is not easy. It threatens entrenched interests. It threatens politically powerful interests. It threatens the economic activity of large segments of the economy. Right? And the Chinese government has been talking for 20 years about the need to rebalance and has been unable to achieve it for very good reasons. It's not easy. The US faces similar problems because if we're going to wean ourselves off of the borrowing that we have engaged in for the last 25 years and more, we will have to increase our savings and reduce our consumption. And increasing savings and reducing consumption is painful. American administrations for 25 years have talked about doing this, and none of them have actually done it. So the world faces some very serious challenges. Adapting to this new international economic environment will be difficult economically, politically, and socially. I believe that we are at the end of an era. Maybe we're at the beginning of the end of an era, but I think that the post-war economic order that we have come to know, that we have all grown up in, is coming to an end. I don't know what will replace it. If I did, I would tell you, but I don't. What I do know is that whatever happens over the next few years as this order comes to an end and is replaced by something else, will affect the quality of lives of our children and our children's children and probably our children's children's children. I got into this business of thinking about the intersection of international politics and international economics because I was convinced that this intersection, this interaction, profoundly affected and profoundly affects the lives of billions of people around the world, most of whom don't understand that. I think it's important for us to recognize that the decisions we make over the next few years will affect the lives of billions of people going forward. My hope is that as we think about this, and as the countries and people of the world work towards a new international economic order, that they will do that in a way that is both wise and successful. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Frieden. That was a fascinating presentation, and it is a strange moment to be living through such a profound transition. I wanted to ask first about something that came up very early in your presentation, which is what seems to be the relationship between war and trade. I'm just thinking of the end of World War II, this idea of free trade going forward. What do you see as that relationship?
Well, conflict among nations obviously is not conducive to international trade, and there is some evidence that countries that trade more with each other tend not to have such conflictual relations.
Countries that trade together.
Stayed together, right. Cordell Hull, who was the Secretary of State during World War II and was in many ways one of the architects of the Bretton Woods system, used to say that we never went to war with a country with which we, the United States, never went to war with a country with which we had a reciprocal trade agreement. So there's some evidence to that effect. It's not ironclad, but it's pretty good. There's another aspect, which is that trade can often be justified, and trade liberalization can be justified on national security grounds. And that's in fact what happened in the 1940s and early 1950s in the US. Remember that the US had been isolationist through most of the interwar period. The Republican Party won the 1946 election, which was not a presidential election. They had the House and the Senate, and they had been very isolationist.
We are not going to participate in this.
They did not want to sign the Bretton Woods Agreement. They did not want the British loan. They did not want the Marshall Plan. They were led by Robert Taft, who ran for president on an isolationist platform. And so the Truman administration had to convince the Republicans to invest in, to believe in trade liberalization, economic ties with our allies. And they did so on national security grounds, by saying, if we don't open our markets to the Europeans and the Japanese, they will go communist. And that convinced the Republicans. That convinced Arthur Vandenberg to sign on to trade liberalization for national security reasons. Now, over time, I think more and more Republicans began to believe in international trade, finance, and investment until relatively recently. But that was the justification that was given. There are people, in fact, who say that the loss of faith in international trade on the part of many Americans is related to the end of the Cold War. No more Cold War, no need to trade with our allies. Let them do things on their own. So there is a complex relationship between trade and national security conflict, as we see even today.
I've spoken with economists for many years about this, and there has always seemed to be a consensus that free trade is good for everybody. It lifts everybody up, we're all wealthier, specifically from the point of view of the US, like we can afford all of these goods we wouldn't be able to otherwise afford. It elevates everybody's quality of life. It seems like maybe there are big gaps in that story, which you talked about. I'm wondering if you could expand a little bit on that, and then maybe talk about what that gap looks like in other countries.
Right. So international trade, almost everyone would agree, is good for what we call aggregate social welfare. It does improve the national economy. But anyone who tells you that there are no trade-offs in economics or in life is either lying or stupid.
Or selling you something.
Or selling you something, probably. The reality is that while trade is good for aggregate social welfare, and there's a lot of evidence to that effect, we have evidence from both history and contemporary examples, it also creates winners and losers. And neoclassical trade theory teaches us that it creates winners and losers. This is nothing new, and every economist should know that trade liberalization will create losers. Now, it creates more winners than losers, and that leads to what we sometimes call the compensation hypothesis. That is, if there's something that's good for the economy as a whole, but makes some people winners and some people losers, you can tax the winners and use that to compensate the losers. And you're still going to have people better off. It's a Pareto improvement. The problem, of course, is that the winners don't like being taxed to compensate the losers, so that often doesn't happen. It varies from country to country. The US does not have much of a compensation scheme along these lines. Some of the Northern European countries have more. And there is evidence that countries that have a broader, deeper, more significant social safety net have had less of a populist backlash controlling for the kinds of shocks that they've had. Right? It's perhaps not surprising, some would say, that two countries that have some of the weakest of the social safety nets, the UK and the US, have had some of the strongest reactions, some of the strongest, in this case, anti-European and anti-globalization reactions. So there is a way for governments to address some of the costs of globalization, the costs of trade liberalization. It's not easy, it's not cheap, and it's politically difficult.
What about this particular moment that we're in right now, as we're all sitting here? How did we get to this moment? What happened?
I think that at some point in the 1990s, early 2000s, governments around the world, in the advanced countries especially, began to say, the traditional manufacturing is the past. The knowledge industries are the future. We're going to invest our energies, our political base, our resources in the knowledge industries, in the college educated, in the young. And so we got country after country that is divided. The US has the prosperous Northeast, the prosperous West Coast, the prosperous big cities in between, which are filled with college educated knowledge industry workers, and then it's got the rest of the country. And this pattern is repeated over and over. The north of England, the north of France, eastern Germany, southern Italy, all of these are areas that have lost much of their industrial base, where regions have suffered very seriously because of the decline in good-paying manufacturing jobs, and where governments have essentially said, well, that's the past. We're going to ignore that and move on to the modern future economy. And although from an economic standpoint that makes perfect sense, politically it turns out to be very, very dangerous.
Because there
are people left behind. And it is not surprising that being economically left behind in this way, that is losing a few jobs in factories in small cities, doesn't stop there. You lose those jobs, property values go down, local property taxes go down, local ability to provide local public services go down, the schools get worse, some of the more educated people leave, the infrastructure declines, law enforcement declines, and people are stuck. And it's not surprising in the American context that these distressed areas that have been distressed for decades, not for a few years, for decades, are also ground zero for things like opioid overdoses, alcoholism, suicidality, what Case and Deaton have called deaths of despair. So these are areas that really have gone through very difficult times and have basically been ignored by most of the advanced countries' governments. And now, so to speak, the chickens are coming home to roost.
This moment that we seem to be transitioning into of maybe friendshoring or not as much free trade as we're used to, if we play that out, what does this world that we're walking into look like? Who are the winners and who are the losers?
Yeah, I think that is what remains to be decided. I think that it seems that the direction the Trump administration wants to move in is one in which there is an American sphere of influence in the Western Hemisphere, with the US less engaged with Europe and maybe engaged economically with Asia, but not so much politically. How the rest of the world adapts to that is really up for grabs. It can continue on with the kind of multilateral institutions that have characterized the world economy for the past 75 years, or fragment among itself. And I think those are questions that every country, every government, every person really has to ask. What kind of world do we want to create as things start to fragment in the contemporary international economic order?
And within the countries themselves, how do you see things evening out with the countries that are high debt, high consumption, and the countries that are high production, high...
These are some really serious adjustment problems.
Okay.
And every country is going to have to deal with them, starting with the US. It is not going to be easy. It is not going to be politically easy. It's not going to be economically easy. But it's going to have to be addressed.
All right. I think we are close to our time, but thank you so much, Dr. Frieden. This is
My great pleasure.
Fascinating topic. And thank you all for your time and attention.
Thank you. Thanks, Stacey.